You don't belong here. The words stayed longer than the echo that followed them, as if the room itself had decided to remember. Elizabeth Carter stood alone now, 43 floors above the city, her office wrapped in glass and late afternoon light, the skyline stretching for miles in clean lines and quiet power, the kind of view people worked decades to earn, the kind that usually made her feel certain, grounded, right. But not today. Today, something small and almost invisible had shifted, and it refused to settle back into place. Her phone buzzed once on the desk, then again, then a third time, each notification sharp and demanding, each one a reminder of the world she controlled with precision, but she didn't reach for it. Instead, her eyes stayed fixed on the faint reflection in the glass, her own silhouette, still, composed, perfectly put together, and behind it, something she couldn't quite name. The sentence replayed again, quieter this time, almost unfamiliar, as if someone else had said it using her voice. You don't belong here. She exhaled slowly, barely noticeable, the kind of breath that doesn't release tension so much as acknowledge it. Down below, traffic moved in orderly streams, headlights beginning to flicker on as the sun lowered itself behind the buildings, bathing everything in a soft amber glow. Normally, she liked this hour. It felt like closure, like control. But now it felt unfinished. Her fingers rested lightly against the edge of her desk, nails perfectly shaped, unmoving, as if even the smallest motion might disturb whatever fragile thought was forming. It wasn't guilt, not exactly. Elizabeth Carter didn't deal in messy emotions like that, not in ways that lingered. She made decisions, she moved forward, she didn't look back. That was how she had built everything standing around her. And yet, something about that moment earlier refused to be categorized, filed away, or dismissed. It hadn't been loud. It hadn't been dramatic. In fact, it had been almost nothing at all. A sentence, a glance, a pause that lasted maybe 2 seconds longer than it should have. But in those 2 seconds, something had misaligned. She shifted her weight slightly, the soft click of her heels against the polished floor echoing more than it should in the quiet office. Outside, a helicopter passed in the distance, its low hum briefly filling the space before fading again, leaving behind that same persistent stillness. Elizabeth finally reached for her phone, then stopped halfway, her hand hovering just above it. For a moment, she didn't recognize the hesitation. That, more than anything, felt unfamiliar. She lowered her hand back down slowly. Her gaze drifted again to the glass, to the reflection that had always looked so certain, so unshakable. But now, for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a complete picture. Not because something was missing, but because something had been added, something small, quiet, and impossible to ignore. And it had started with a man who hadn't said a single word in return. The memory did not arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, like a scene she had not intended to replay but could no longer avoid. The polished marble floor of the lobby reflecting light in long, clean streaks, the quiet hum of conversations blending with the distant chime of elevators opening and closing, everything moving with the efficiency she had built her reputation on, and in the middle of it, him, standing just slightly off-center, not lost, not confused, just still, as if he understood the space without needing to prove that he belonged in it. His jacket worn at the edges, a faint crease along the sleeve that suggested long days and careful use. One hand holding a small backpack, the other resting loosely at his side, and beside him, a little girl no older than 6, her fingers wrapped gently around his, not pulling, not fidgeting, just present. And that was when Elizabeth had noticed them, not because they were loud or disruptive, but because they did not fit the pattern her mind had already decided was correct for that place. Her heels clicking with quiet authority as she approached, her attention divided between a call she had just ended and the next decision waiting for her upstairs. And yet she had stopped, just long enough to let her eyes settle on him, to take in the details, to reach a conclusion in less than a second, and then she had spoken. The words delivered with the same calm certainty she used in boardrooms and negotiations, not raised, not sharp, just final, as if stating a simple fact, and for a moment the world had paused, not visibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for something subtle to shift, because he did not react the way people usually did. There was no apology, no explanation, no defensive tone trying to reclaim space. He simply looked at her, not directly challenging, not avoiding either, just a steady, grounded glance that lasted a fraction longer than expected, and then he gave a small nod, almost respectful, as if acknowledging her presence rather than her judgment, and that was all. No tension carried forward, no attempt to change her mind, just a quiet acceptance that did not feel like surrender. And as she moved past him, already returning to the rhythm of her day, something in that moment resisted being left behind. She noticed it in the way her steps felt slightly out of sync, in the way the air seemed thicker for just a second longer than it should have. And then there was the child, her voice soft but clear, asking him a question Elizabeth could not fully hear. Something about whether they were early, and he answered in a tone so calm it almost disappeared into the background, reassuring, steady, the kind of voice that made time feel less urgent. And Elizabeth had kept walking, because that was what she always did. She moved forward. She did not linger. But even as the elevator doors closed in front of her reflection, there had been a brief, uninvited thought, not fully formed, not yet understood, just a quiet disruption, like a note slightly out of tune in an otherwise perfect composition. And now, standing in her office hours later, that same note returned, clearer, more persistent, not demanding attention, but refusing to fade. And for the first time, she realized it was not what he had done that stayed with her. It was what he had not done, and how that absence had quietly unsettled everything she thought she had seen. Back in the office, the rhythm returned, but it no longer felt seamless. Elizabeth finally picked up her phone, scanning the notifications with the same precision she had relied on for years. Emails marked urgent, calendar adjustments, a message from her executive assistant reminding her of a meeting in 12 minutes. All of it familiar, all of it manageable, and yet her focus drifted in small, almost imperceptible gaps, like a system running perfectly on the surface but lagging underneath. She moved toward her desk, each step measured, controlled, the soft sound of her heels grounding her in routine, and she began to respond, one message at a time, clear, concise, efficient. But even as she typed, her mind replayed something else, not the words she had spoken earlier, but the way he had stood there afterward, unchanged, unaffected in a way that did not feel careless, but intentional, as if he had chosen not to engage in something that did not deserve his energy, and that detail unsettled her more than any argument could have, because she understood arguments, she knew how to win them, how to navigate them, how to end them. But this had offered her nothing to respond to, no friction to push against, no resistance to overcome, just a quiet presence that had remained steady while everything around it moved. She paused her typing for a moment, her fingers hovering above the screen, remembering how the child had looked up at him, not confused, not embarrassed, just trusting, completely at ease, as if nothing unusual had happened, as if the world still made sense exactly as it was, and that trust had not been shaken, not even slightly, which meant that whatever he had carried into that moment, whatever weight or judgment had been placed in front of him, he had not allowed it to pass through to her. And that realization sat heavier than she expected. Elizabeth set her phone down slowly, her gaze drifting again toward the window. The city now dimmer, the lights more pronounced, each building glowing with its own quiet purpose. She had spent years building a life where nothing was left uncertain, where every variable was anticipated, every outcome considered. And yet something as simple as a brief encounter in a lobby had introduced a question she could not immediately answer, not because it was complex, but because it did not follow the rules she had relied on. She turned back to her desk as a soft knock sounded at the door, her assistant stepping in with a tablet in hand, offering a quick update about the upcoming meeting. Elizabeth nodded, listening, responding, stepping back into her role without hesitation, her voice steady, her instructions clear, nothing outwardly different. And yet as the assistant left and the door closed behind her, the silence returned, and with it, that same unresolved detail, not loud, not demanding, but present, persistent, like a quiet shift in the foundation she had always trusted. And for the first time, she did not try to dismiss it. She simply stood there, allowing the question to exist without forcing an answer. And in that stillness, something began to take shape. Not a conclusion, not yet, but a recognition that whatever she had seen earlier had not been the full picture, and that perhaps, without realizing it, She had been looking at the wrong part of the frame the entire time. The meeting began exactly on time, as everything in Elizabeth Carter's world always did. A long glass table stretching across the room, screens glowing softly along the walls, voices measured and controlled as executives presented numbers, projections, strategies that moved millions of dollars with a single decision, and she sat at the head, composed, attentive, every detail in place, her posture straight, her expression neutral, her questions precise, the kind that guided conversations without ever appearing forceful. And for a while, the rhythm held, familiar and dependable, the language of performance and outcomes filling the space with a sense of purpose she had trusted for years. But then, in the middle of a presentation about expansion timelines, something small interrupted her focus, not from the room, but from within, a subtle shift, almost like a pause between breaths that lasted just a second too long. And suddenly, the voice speaking across from her sounded distant, not because it had changed, but because her attention had moved elsewhere. She glanced down briefly at the polished surface of the table, catching the reflection of her own hands, still, controlled, perfectly still, and without warning, another image layered itself over that reflection, not fully formed, just a fragment, a memory of a smaller hand wrapped around a larger one, steady and unafraid. And the contrast unsettled her more than she expected. She lifted her gaze again, refocusing on the speaker, nodding slightly, asking a follow-up question that was sharp, relevant, exactly what was needed. And the meeting continued without disruption. No one noticed the momentary shift. No one saw the quiet distance that had opened and then closed again behind her eyes, because outwardly, nothing had changed. She was still in control, still leading, still making decisions that shaped everything around her. And yet, beneath that surface, something was no longer aligning the way it always had. As another executive began to speak, outlining a risk mitigation plan, Elizabeth listened, but not in the same way, her mind tracing a different pattern, one that did not involve numbers or outcomes, but something far less defined. She remembered the way the man had not moved to justify himself, how there had been no urgency in him to correct her assumption, no visible need to be recognized or accepted, and that absence of reaction had carried a kind of weight she had not been prepared for, because it suggested something she rarely encountered, a sense of self that did not depend on the approval of the room. She leaned back slightly in her chair, a small movement, almost imperceptible, as if creating just enough space to examine the thought without letting it interrupt her responsibilities. The conversation continued around her, charts shifting on the screens, voices overlapping in careful coordination, and still, that earlier moment remained, not as a distraction, but as a quiet counterpoint to everything unfolding in front of her. And for the first time in a long time, Elizabeth found herself questioning not the data, not the strategy, but her own instinct, the one she had relied on without hesitation, the one that had told her she understood people within seconds, that she could read a room, assess a situation, determine who belonged and who did not. And now, that certainty felt less solid, not broken, but softened at the edges. And as the meeting moved toward its conclusion, decisions finalized, next steps assigned, she realized something she had not expected, that the most significant shift in her day had not happened in this room filled with influence and control, but in a quiet moment she had almost dismissed. And that realization did not resolve anything. It did not offer clarity or comfort, but it stayed with her, steady and present, like a question that no longer asked to be answered immediately, only to be acknowledged. The meeting ended with quiet efficiency, chairs sliding back in near unison, devices being gathered, voices lowering into brief side conversations before fading out into the hallway. And Elizabeth remained seated for a moment longer than usual, her hands resting lightly on the table as the room emptied, the large screens dimming one by one until only the reflection of the city lights remained faintly visible on their dark surfaces. She stood slowly, smoothing the front of her jacket out of habit rather than necessity, and walked toward the window at the far end of the room, the glass cool beneath her fingertips as she paused there, looking down at the street far below, where people moved in small, purposeful lines, each carrying something unseen, something that did not announce itself but shaped the way they walked, the the way they held themselves. And for the first time that day, she allowed her mind to return fully to that earlier moment without trying to interrupt it. She replayed it again, not just the words she had spoken, but everything around them. The stillness of the man, the quiet presence of the child, the absence of tension where she had expected it. And this time, she noticed something she had missed before, something subtle in the way he had shifted his attention immediately after. Not toward her, not toward the people watching, but toward the girl beside him, as if she had always been the only reference point that mattered, as if the moment had already passed for him the second it no longer affected her. And that realization settled differently, not sharp, not uncomfortable, but steady, like a truth that did not need to prove itself. Elizabeth exhaled slowly, her reflection in the glass no longer the only thing she saw, because now it carried something else with it. A quiet comparison she had not invited but could not dismiss. She had spent years learning how to command attention, how to shape perception, how to ensure that every room she entered recognized her presence. And yet this man had done the opposite. He had taken up no more space than necessary, offered no resistance, no explanation, and still, somehow, he had remained intact in a way that did not rely on any of those things. She turned away from the window, reaching for her phone again, but instead of opening her messages, she paused, her thumb hovering over the screen as a different thought surfaced, simple and unexpected. She did not actually know why he had been there. She had not asked, had not given him the space to answer even if she had. The conclusion had come too quickly, formed from patterns she had trusted without question, and now, for the first time, that speed felt less like strength and more like omission. She slipped the phone into her pocket without unlocking it and walked toward the door, her steps quieter now, not because she was uncertain, but because something in her attention had shifted inward. As she stepped into the hallway, the building felt slightly different, not changed, but newly observed. The same polished floors, the same controlled lighting, the same quiet order. And yet she moved through it with a slower awareness, her gaze no longer passing over details automatically. She noticed a maintenance cart tucked neatly against the wall, a faint scuff mark near the baseboard, the distant sound of someone laughing 2 floors down, small things she would normally filter out without thinking. And as she reached the elevator and pressed the call button, she realized that whatever had unsettled her earlier had not disappeared, but it had changed shape. It was no longer just a question about a single moment. It was something wider, something that touched the way she moved through every space, every decision, every assumption. And as the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, she stepped inside, catching her reflection once more in the mirrored panel. And this time, she did not look away immediately, because for the first time, she was not entirely certain she had been seeing everything clearly before. The elevator descended smoothly, the soft hum of machinery blending with the muted city sounds filtering in through the building's walls, and Elizabeth stood still, arms loosely crossed, observing the mirrored interior as if it were a quiet room rather than a vehicle, her mind tracing over fragments of earlier moments with an almost forensic precision. The way the man had shifted his weight slightly to accommodate the child, the subtle tightening of his jaw when he adjusted the strap of her backpack, the way he moved through the lobby without needing to command attention, and each image returned to her now with a clarity that demanded recognition. She pressed the button for the lobby once more, though she had no meeting there, no appointment, only a vague curiosity that had grown persistent, a quiet pull she could not ignore. And as the elevator slowed, descending past each floor, she felt the familiar rhythm of the building, the echo of footsteps, the soft murmur of conversations. She could not hear, and yet it all seemed different now, as if the space itself had shifted in subtle ways she could sense but not immediately identify. The doors opened with a gentle chime, and she stepped out, moving with deliberate calm, heels clicking softly on polished marble, her eyes scanning the lobby with detached interest, yet catching again that small scene she had seen before, a man standing not fully in the crowd, a child beside him, neither fidgeting, neither demanding, just present, the simplicity of their existence striking against the backdrop of orderly chaos around them. And she paused, not fully understanding why she lingered, but feeling compelled by the quiet consistency of their presence, the small details, how he adjusted the child's coat, The careful way he knelt to tie a shoe, the gentle yet assured motion of handing her a small object, perhaps a toy or a note, each action unremarkable by itself, yet together forming a language of care and attention she had long forgotten to notice. And Elizabeth felt a strange warmth, not sentimental, not intrusive, but clarifying, a subtle lesson in how presence alone could alter perception. She stepped closer without intending confrontation, merely to observe, and the child looked up at him, smiled, and he returned the smile without breaking his calm, an exchange that required no words yet conveyed everything necessary. Elizabeth's gaze softened, a reflection of herself in their rhythm of interaction, a momentary insight into how strength could coexist with gentleness, how certainty did not require dominance, how quiet consistency could wield power over assumptions more effectively than any argument. And she realized she had been hasty before, assuming that judgment required engagement, that authority demanded display, that presence needed to be loud. And in that recognition she felt a release, small, almost imperceptible, but grounding, a subtle untangling of the rigid patterns she had relied on. And as she continued to watch them, moving slowly, to join the exit without rushing, the world around her resumed its ordinary pace. People moving, footsteps echoing, voices murmuring, elevators humming. Yet for her, nothing was ordinary anymore. Each step now carried the weight of observation, of reflection, of a quiet question she did not need to answer immediately. And in that space, standing in the lobby with soft light falling across polished surfaces, she allowed herself to simply exist, letting the small, steady presence of another remind her that understanding could grow without confrontation, that change could arrive without force, and that even in a place she had always controlled, there were lessons waiting in silence. Marcus stepped lightly onto the cracked concrete of the playground, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the swings and slides, the air carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass and distant city exhaust, his daughter skipping ahead with a small backpack bouncing against her back, her laughter quiet but bright against the muted hum of the surrounding streets. And he watched her with careful attention, adjusting her coat when a breeze lifted it slightly, crouching briefly to fix a loose shoelace, the motions practiced, fluid, deliberate, each small gesture spoken in a language of care without words. As Elizabeth observed from the edge of the playground, remaining partly hidden behind a column of the nearby building, the warmth of the sun catching the edges of her hair, her posture relaxed but alert, arms crossed loosely, heels resting against the cool concrete as she allowed herself to take in the scene without interference, the rhythm of his actions drawing her focus. In ways she did not fully expect, the child turning occasionally to ask questions or comment on her surroundings, Marcus responding with patience and clarity, never hurried, never forced. And in that simplicity, Elizabeth noticed patterns she had not allowed herself to see before, the way attention without expectation shaped the environment, how guidance could be gentle yet precise, how presence alone could create a space of security and trust. And she allowed herself a quiet acknowledgement of that realization, letting it sit without analysis, without judgment, simply as observation, a subtle shift in perception that she had not anticipated, the two of them moving through the playground without incident, no one else drawing attention, no interruption of the quiet harmony. And as Marcus guided his daughter toward the small bench beneath the oak tree, she caught a glance of him folding a stray piece of paper he had picked up, placing it neatly into his coat pocket, a small act. Unnoticed by anyone else, yet weighted with care, Elizabeth adjusted her stance, the sunlight warming her back as she remained in place, letting the scene imprint itself on her mind, her own breathing slowing to match the cadence of what she observed, the simplicity of their interaction stark against the expectations she had carried into the day, the contrast of control versus calm, command versus care, and in that contrast, a realization began to take root, not loud, not dramatic, merely present, that patience, dignity, and consistency could teach lessons more enduring than words or force, and she felt a subtle shift in how she regarded the man, not just as a stranger who had entered her world for a moment, but as someone who, through the quiet and deliberate acts of attention to another, had reframed a small corner of her perception, the shadows lengthening across the playground, the hum of the city stretching into evening. Elizabeth standing still, observing without interference, absorbing the unspoken rhythm of presence and responsibility, a lesson in humanity that needed no proclamation, no acknowledgement, just being seen, just existing alongside it. And as the girl climbed onto the swing, laughing, and Marcus stood nearby, steady and unhurried, Elizabeth recognized that some truths were revealed not in confrontation, not in argument, but in the deliberate quiet of ordinary acts, a quiet that resonated far beyond the immediate moment. As the sun lowered behind the buildings, casting long golden rays across the quiet streets, Elizabeth lingered near the edge of the playground, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, watching Marcus and his daughter move through their small world with deliberate care, each step unhurried, each gesture intentional. She noticed how he adjusted the straps of the backpack once more, checking that it rested comfortably, how he crouched slightly to speak to her at eye level, his voice calm and even, the words chosen with care, not to impress or instruct, but simply to guide. And as she observed, Elizabeth felt a subtle shift in her understanding of authority and attention, the kind that does not rely on volume or force, but on consistency and awareness. The child laughed softly, running a short distance to touch a swing, and he followed without haste, holding her hand until she felt steady, and then letting go with a gentle nod, the rhythm of their interaction almost musical in its quiet precision. Elizabeth felt a surprising sense of stillness settle over her, the city sounds around her dimming into background hum. She took a small step forward, not to intrude, but to witness more closely, noting the careful way he picked up a stray leaf that had blown into the pathway, placing it aside without comment, small acts of attentiveness that revealed a deep consideration for the world around him. She realized that these unnoticed moments carried a weight far greater than any spoken acknowledgement could provide, each one layering a silent lesson in patience, empathy, and dignity. And she noticed that her own breathing had slowed, her posture relaxed, her hands no longer tense, as if absorbing the calm radiating from him had created a subtle equilibrium in her. The child asked another question, about a bird perched on the edge of the fence, and he answered with patience, bending slightly so his head was level with hers, listening fully, the simplicity and attentiveness in that act more compelling than any conversation she had experienced in her carefully curated meetings or presentations. Elizabeth shifted her gaze, taking in the balance of control and ease in his movements, how he managed presence without demanding attention, how he held responsibility with quiet assurance. And she recognized a reflection of principles she had long valued but expressed differently, a reminder that influence did not always require display, that guidance did not need assertion, that respect and care could coexist naturally without conflict. As Marcus adjusted the swing for his daughter, checking its height and alignment before stepping back, she saw the trust in the child's eyes, the calm assurance in the way she let go and swung gently, and Elizabeth felt an unspoken understanding forming within her, a quiet recognition that some of the most profound impacts were delivered not through force or declaration, but through steady, thoughtful presence. And she allowed herself a rare, unguarded smile, small but genuine, acknowledging internally the lesson unfolding before her eyes. The playground bathed in the golden hue of evening, Marcus and his daughter moving as though time itself had slowed, and for a brief, illuminating moment, Elizabeth understood that the measure of character and influence often resided not in the grand gestures, but in the quiet, attentive, consistent acts that passed unnoticed by the world, yet changed everything. The sun had fully dipped behind the skyline, leaving the playground bathed in the soft glow of streetlights and the fading warmth of evening. Elizabeth remained at the edge, still observing, her coat slightly lifted by a gentle breeze, the air cooler now, carrying hints of damp earth and distant city traffic. Marcus knelt beside his daughter to pick up a small fallen leaf, turning it over in his hands, examining it carefully before placing it into her backpack with a small smile. She watched him from a distance, noting the patience in his movements, the quiet attentiveness that required no words, no justification, only presence. The child giggled, pointing to a shadow cast by the swings, and he leaned in, matching her gaze, nodding, explaining in a calm, measured tone, and Elizabeth felt an unexpected clarity in how actions without display could teach more than speech. She took a step closer without thinking, heels clicking softly against the concrete, yet maintaining enough distance to remain unobtrusive, observing the ease with which he navigated the small space, the way he balanced guidance with freedom, care with autonomy, and the realization deepened that influence need not assert itself to exist. He helped her adjust the swing, checking that it moved freely without touching her unnecessarily, and she laughed, enjoying the sensation of momentum and trust, her father standing back, watching, allowing her to experiment safely. And Elizabeth noted the subtle exchange, the balance of control and release, the quiet assertion of responsibility without overbearing intervention, a lesson in humanity unfolding naturally. She exhaled slowly, a slight smile touching her lips, feeling a sense of stillness she had not known she needed. The world around them continued, a distant siren, the faint chatter of neighbors walking along the sidewalk, the glow of apartments turning on one by one in the nearby buildings. Yet none of it intruded upon the delicate rhythm she was witnessing. She reflected on the contrast to her own life, the meetings, the strategies, the polished surfaces, the need to be seen, to assert, to respond, and realized that much of her influence had depended on performance rather than presence, on projection rather than quiet understanding. And for the first time in a long time, she felt that presence, that calm, that dignity in simple, attentive action, held more weight than any argument or directive she had delivered. Marcus helped the child down from the swing and guided her to the small bench beneath the oak, crouching briefly to ensure she was steady, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and Elizabeth watched without interference, noting the continuity, the unbroken flow of attention that required no recognition, no applause, only quiet responsibility. And as they began to pack up their small belongings to leave, she observed how naturally he gathered the items, placed the backpack over his shoulder, offered a hand to steady her daughter as they walked toward the exit, each movement deliberate, calm, and unhurried. And in that steady rhythm, Elizabeth felt a subtle transformation, a quiet moral forming without words. That true strength and care were often expressed not in the grand gestures or commands, but in the consistency of presence, in the gentle guidance and dignity maintained through ordinary acts. And as they reached the sidewalk and began to walk into the approaching night, she remained for a moment longer, letting the lesson settle, the streetlights casting long shadows, and she understood fully, without confrontation or explanation, that some of the most powerful truths in life were revealed quietly, simply through being, witnessing, and allowing oneself to see the value in the ordinary, the consistent, and the kind.